Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to speak here. But on the other hand, John Welshman just said when he started the conference, that would be the cool part of the conference. Now we're talking about the museums, the dusty part. How do estates and museums cooperate? In this panel we will discuss a few questions. These are the questions. Sorry? These are the questions we are going to discuss. And it's about to get some insight into the discussions that are related to estates and museums. And it's an honor for me then to introduce to you Joost Declercq from MuseumDhoent-Dhaenens in St. Martens-Latem in Belgium, and Thomas Köhler from the Berlinische Galerie. And for me, and that is both the art historian and the museum director speaking, these two museums are very important in the way they work with their collection. So while you are in Berlin, go to the Berlinische Galerie. There's a fabulous exhibition on the visionary architecture of Paul Gusch, Bruno Taut and Bruno Scherbart. And the next time you are in Ghent, please do not miss Dhondt-Dhaenens. One of the ideas of this conference is that not only speakers bring their knowledge, but also to initiate discussions and new thoughts. Therefore, we agreed on this kind of format here in the panel. We have 3 short statements by the 3 museum directors, and then we will talk about these, and our guideline are these questions. And that is also because I presume you've attended a lot of conferences by now. We are coming near the conference dip. Okay, I started studying art history in 1981. And at that time, Joost Declercq was running the VZW Gewat in Ghent, a venue that showed intriguing solo exhibitions and that played a big role for a young Dutch art historian like myself. We went to Eindhoven or to Ghent to learn. Later, because all the other things of his biography, you can read it. Later, he started a gallery in Ghent and became involved in the Fondation Hans Hartog and Anna-Eva Bergman in Antibes. And since 2004, he is the director of the before-mentioned MuseumDhoent-Dhaenens. So he can talk about the change of perspective. On the one hand, managing an estate. On the other hand, managing a museum. And in his presentation, he will now focus in the beginning on the estate. You have the...
Good afternoon, and thank you very much, the organizers, for inviting me. Although I feel a little bit strange duck in the pool in a certain way, because I have like so many different lives and I'm not really linked to one or other department, neither estate, neither museum, neither gallerist. There's one red line through all the things I do, is that I'm always very close to a lot of artists. And I think for me, in anything what I do or whatever I do, I try to put the artist in the central place. I think this is the most important thing, and I think we should absolutely not forget that. If you are here, it's not about objects, it's not about us, it's about artists and what they have to say. And I think this is the most important thing. I intended to give some reflection, departing of the Fondation Hans Hartog and Anna-Eva Bergman, just to show the difference in thinking between a foundation and a museum or a gallery. But we decided to do it very shortly so that we can have more discussions afterwards. But anyway, I think I have to try to show you a few ideas. The creation of the foundation is very similar to most of the things that you hear here. At a certain moment, Hans Hartog dies. He leaves a huge patrimonium. There is, in France, there's a law that you have 5 years to create a foundation. And if you don't are able to create a foundation, the whole foundation goes back to the Fondation de France. Fondation de France is like an a very big organization, depending on the government, even directly on the minister, who is obliged then to look if a creation makes sense or not. The advantage of a foundation is very simple. If you have a foundation, you don't pay taxes, but you have to exist forever, eternally, and you never can have any financial support by the government. On the other hand, if you are not a foundation, then it's very simple. Then they divide the patrimonium and they bring a little bit to Beaubourg, a little bit to Bordeaux, a little bit to Saint-Étienne, and whatever they can put it down, they bring it down. So after 4 years, the foundation was not made, and François Hertz, who was the head of the director then of the Fondation de France, and who became also the director of the Fondation Hans Hartog, asked me if I would come with him to see. He asked me first, do you know Hartog? I said, yes, I know Hartog. And do you know his work? I said, yes, I know his work. And are you interested to come to Antibes? Antibes is always nice, also it's nice weather. Of course, I'm interested to come to Antibes. And we went together. And the first thing we saw, that is everything I knew about art or about an artist, that I didn't know anything. And I really mean it. The first thing I mentioned is that there is a big gap between the perception of an artist and the reality of an artist. And this is something very, very important, and this will play the fundamental role in the whole approach that we developed for the foundation. To be short, the good things was, there was a huge patrimonium. There were like 5,000 paintings, 9,000 drawings, 20,000 photographs, I don't know, 30,000 editions, and so on, and so on, and so on. It was a huge patrimonium. Second good thing that was there was the people working there. And I heard this morning saying, Flavin, that he didn't find anybody to run the estate, so he was obliged to do it himself, and I really agree on that. But we were lucky, all the people working there were artists. And this is very fundamental because they have a completely different eye and a completely different strategy than people who are coming out of the museum world or coming out of the academic world. And this is very fundamental. The director, François Hertz, was an artist. And this was absolutely a very important positive thing. Another thing, which is always helpful, but isn't now everybody, there was quite a lot of money involved. And an awful lot of money, when I mean an awful lot of money, it's not only the patrimonium, the real estate, but there was also quite a lot of money on the bank, and there was also a huge patrimonium where a big part was still disponible to be sold or to work with, which is very important because this will give us the link to the art world. And as we all know, the market is part of the job, and if you are not on the market as an artist, you don't exist. So this opportunity to get an access to the art world was a very important thing. And a last thing, two last things, very important, was the location. It's a beautiful location. I should show you. How do you do this? I go very fast, but you see these are the studios. This is the house with the swimming pool. There's a beautiful garden with palm trees. So if you want to have a nice holiday, go there. So the location was immediately very important. And the last thing, which I think was the most beautiful gift we got, is that Hartog just mentioned, I want to have a foundation. Punt. Nothing else. Not what it should be, how it should like, what it should be, the contents, nothing. I just want a foundation. And this is very typical, and I refer to the freedom that an artist take like Rosenberg. This is very typical an artist, and also Hartog. Hartog once said, I want to be free from myself and from the others. This absolutely longing of complete freedom, even from himself, was very fundamental. And that's also what he created, saying, I want a foundation, and it's the future who will decide what happens. The negative things, I'm going to go a little bit fast. The negative things were also very serious. First of all, there was the image of Hartog. And the image of Hartog was at that time complicated, because Hartog was a huge star in the 40s, 50s, 60s, was a huge star, as well in Germany as in France. He was like the star of Europe. But by coming in, the American art from the abstraction of the 50s and the 60s, and then the whole bunch of American art came in Europe, this whole generation, and not only Hartog, but also Mathieu, even Yves Klein was a very long time pushed away, because everybody was interested in this American art, and that was one thing. Second thing is that they were considered as very bourgeois, because the American art was much more radical in a certain way than the European art. So they were in a very bad moment. Another thing which I come later on is that another big problem, of course, were the debts. And I told you it was an awful lot of money, that's true, but mostly if there's an awful lot of money, there's an awful lot of debts in the same time. Mostly these things go together for some reason. I never understood why, but it seems to be like that. And when I mean big debts, what happened? Hartog died in '89, the market was very high, the people who needed to estimate the patrimonium estimated on a very high level, was like 3 million French francs, which was huge. But of course, 1 year later was the crisis, and the patrimonium was like 1/3 of the estimation. But all the calculations for honorariums from lawyers, whatever, were built or based on the 3 million. So this gives us a huge amount of debts. Third thing, which was very negative, was the museums and the government, because we just talked about what's about the government. The government was really disgusting, because we proposed saying, let's fall the debts, and we will see how we can manage. And it was about, I remember it was like 25 million French francs. And we said, cool, let's fall the debts, you pay the debts, and we do what we can do to keep the foundation. They were not interested. And a very funny story in the meantime, we got a huge collection of Julio Gonzalez. And we say, look, you can get this Julio Gonzalez for 25 million. No, it's too much. So, okay, after 3 years, the whole procedure, after 3 years, we sold them for 600 million. And we were 3 left, and this government bought the 3 for 25 million, which was funny. This is government, this is government. But to give you the idea, we got a lot of debts, and this is very stressful, because you have to run a whole company, and every day you're with this money problem, although you're sitting on a mountain of money. The market, I told you, was just a crisis of the market when we started, was really very important. And then there was a last thing which was quite conflictual with the experts and the museums. The museums didn't want it at all that we became a foundation, for the simple reason that they wanted that we divided all the works to the different museums, because then they got a huge patrimonium for them. They were happy to say to Boboer, look, I have 80 works more from Hartog, but that was the only reason. It was just for personal reason that all this museum wanted to divide all the works. And sometimes with reason, because you have museums specialized in a certain period, other ones in another period. And at least the experts. The experts were even the worst, I must say. We processed like 3 years against them, because they wanted us that there was one person, the expert of Hans Hartog. And we say, no, the foundation is the expert of Hartog, not one person. If I leave the foundation, I have nothing to say anymore. I'm not an expert anymore. Even this was a really big problem. So these were the problems, but this learned us also a lot. And what we decided very fast then to say, very fast, this took months and months and years and hours of discussions and big fights and whatever. We decided, look, we don't want a monographic museum, because we were convinced that the monographic museum is the death of an artist. This is like a sarcophage around the artist, and you really block him, and we didn't want to do that. And the second thing we decided, we don't have an opinion. We don't have any opinion or meaning about the work or whatever. It's the outside world who should decide what to do, what happens, what can be happen, whatever. But we don't have any opinion about the work. And this was a very, very important and very good decision. So finally we created a foundation, which of course got as purpose to put Hartog and Anna Eva Bergman on the map. But much more than that, it wanted to be a kind of knowledge center about the practice of an artist And this is very important. And the position of the artist in today's society. And this gave us an awful lot of openness to work. Here you feel immediately the big difference with museums. Musea are busy with objects. Estates are busy with practices of artists. They are busy with artists. They are not busy with objects. And this is a really big difference, and you never can mix this up. That's why I would say never bring an estate under a museum. Don't do it. No, not a good idea. And another thing which I wanted to indeed say on top of it, and this you heard already this morning if you saw Helene or all the people of the foundations, a museum is never able, neither to have emotionally, neither in investment, neither in diversity. For instance, the museum and the market is already two things who doesn't fit together. So this whole emotional energy that is put in a foundation by hundreds of people, private people, family, not family, whatever, is never comparable by the way a museum works. A museum works from 9 to 5. If you make a show in Paris, and it's 5 to 5, and the artist is busy to making a big sculpture, and it's nearly falling down, they say, it's 5 to 5, we go. Mm-hmm. This is the museum. Mm-hmm. And I generalize, and I put it a little bit black and white, but it's a little bit that. So what we did very fastly, we invested in three things. One, in accommodation, because we think it was important, as we have a beautiful place, to give a good accommodation to everybody who wants to come to the foundation. And this is about curators, scientific researchers, and the most important thing where we learned the most are artists. An awful lot of, we invited in the beginning an awful lot of artists, Christopher Wool, Kelly, all these people are invited, because they gave us another look to how we should see the work, how the works could have a future. We invested enormously in ICT. Why? Because the visualization of all the work, that's one thing. But linking this visual material, I told you, it's a huge patrimonium, linking this visual material also on the reality of the work at that time is huge, because every piece is linked to an exhibition, the exhibition is linked to other artists, and the artist is linked to the writings about this. So you get a kind of huge data bank of a whole period of 60 years of abstraction, with also the reflections, the networks, the critics, and whatever. And the third thing we invested an awful lot in is the accessibility of the work, because the most important thing, you can visualize all what you want. If you cannot see visually, physically the work, you cannot do anything. And also this is very different than a museum. If you see a museum, they're treating some works in the cellars, and there are so many in the rooms upstairs, and that's it. In the foundation, every day, but really every day, we took out like 300 or 400 pieces. In the evening, we put them back, because there was somebody coming in and said, I want to see all the, in the morning he was on the computers, and he said, look, all these pieces I want to see in real. So the same day, we could show him them. And this is fantastic. Where you can handle so many pieces, nobody can do that. And this is the playground for gallerists, for museum people and whatever. In a minimum of time, they can really go through 600 works if they want, without any problem. And this was a very important thing. And also there we learned a lot. From investing in these three things, we learned, of course, the complexity of the artist, which we already got, and the importance of the market. And there I don't want to go too much in the market, but one of the things that we learned, there is not something like one market. And museums are also a market, and alternative spaces are also a market. It's just a different way of market, but it's all market. And it's not one market, there are an awful lot of different markets. I give one example. If you have Dubuffet, you have Dubuffet sold for a fortune. If it's a good Dubuffet from the 30s or whatever, it's really a fortune. And you have Dubuffets that you can buy in the Koophof here just in front, because it's just posters or whatever. And I think this kind of controlling this market is, you have to be very conscious what this market really is. And because of this, museums are completely unable to run estates. They are not busy with that. They are absolutely not busy. Another thing which is very important, I think, and which is also very in contrary working of the museums, is there is a huge distance between the image we have of the artist and the reality of the artist. And I told it before, and I tried to show it to you very fastly. Hartog was considered as the person of the, first of all, as a person who made very few work. Even his best friends from Beaubourg, they thought he made like 20 works a year. He did hundreds a year. He did even 20, 30 a day. So the idea of Hartog being in his room, making very spiritually a painting, forget it. It was really a factory, But this is the link of what the artist, how the artist wants to present himself and the reality of the world. And I show you here a very funny thing. This is a drawing from the 50s. This is a work that he started but didn't finish. And this is a work that was finished. And what you see, it's not and this was always written through all the critics, all museum people. Everybody who was writing about that work was about the spontaneous gesture of the painting. I don't know. The thing I learned is that we look very bad. We don't know how to look. We are looking with our ears and out of a context, but we don't look out of the reality of the work. And that's what I want to say in a certain way, which was already said this morning, but opening a foundation and having these openings and no taboos, it really gives you the possibility of looking differently to the reality of the artist. And this is, for me, the purpose of the foundation, in the sense that it gives you the possibility on younger generation, other generations, to reflect on new procedures in creating art and in the relation with the world and in the market. Because otherwise, we always stay in this kind of very romantic idea of the artist making an object, and the object has a value and we sell it. And I think this idea is very important for the future. The last thing that I want to say is, of course, the Foundation Hartog or Rosenberg or whatever are really important, very big institutions. And I'm really defending the idea for smaller foundations to make group of foundations. Because what is the most important thing? You need a very good location. You need accessibility to the work in a very fast way. And you need to be able to invest in the ICT. And these are three fundamental things if you want to give a future to the artists you want to defend. I thank you.
This is going to be a fun discussion. When you were in, I told you earlier, 1981 I started studying, and when you were interested in Berlin culture, art, and especially the fact that this Berlin culture has always been very broad and not just one single stylistic development, the place to be was the Berlinische Galerie. That was where you could learn that. So for me, that was a very important museum. And compared to Joost Declercq, Thomas Köhler has a similar impressive resume, as you may all have seen. He was curator in residence at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York, director of program at the Documenta 10, acting director of the Kunstmuseum Wolfsburg, and since 2008, deputy director of the Berlinische Galerie, responsible for exhibitions and collections, and since 2010 he's the director, so probably responsible for even more. I'm looking forward to what you are going to tell us now and how that is relating to...
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, Loretta, thank you for having me here. It's a very high-profile symposium, so thanks again for organizing all this. It's fantastic, thank you. So, well, Berlinische Galerie has a very difficult name to pronounce even for Germans, so I wanted to give you some information on our mission, which is rather simple. It is, when the museum was founded in 1975, the founders had the idea to found a place for art made in Berlin. It sounds very simple, but it's rather complicated because it means that the artist has to have lived and worked sometime in Berlin. It does not mean that Berlin has to be the theme of the work or anything else. So simply Berlin as a place of artistic production. The idea was good, but the founders were lacking a very essential thing, a collection. So, and they didn't have a building either, I should add. So the story of our museum is rather wild and turbulent. So in the beginning, it was of essential importance for them to build up a collection. And my predecessors, they deliberately were looking for artist estates. Beginning in 1975, they gradually built up a collection of very important but mostly lesser known artists, because that was their mission at that time as well, and their idea, to rediscover artists who were persecuted during the National Socialist dictatorship, or women artists especially, who were completely forgotten. So the estates which came into the collection needed really to be researched and rediscovered. We did that, I mean, as you all know, museums are very slow. So basically, we are still working on the research of these first estates which were added to the collection in the 70s and early 80s. We did that in a very slow and deliberate way, and we still work today with these estates. So that's the main point, in fact, of my statement here, that you hardly know at the time when an artist dies which importance his estate will have one day. Because we're not talking about the big names here. We're not talking about Beckman, Rauschenberg, Donald Judd, or somebody like that. But we're talking about these mid-range artists who had their career, who pass away, and whose estates need to be taken care of. And in fact, that was the strategy right from the beginning, to rediscover and to evaluate what was made by them, actually. So, and I'd like to give you some examples to show you how wide the range is we have to cover. I mean, unfortunately, this is in German, but I'm going to translate it. We have 5 main departments. That's the fine art department with the sculptures and paintings. We have the prints department, prints and drawings, the photographic collection, the architecture collection, and the artist archives. And that's pretty interesting because right from the beginning, the founder of Berlinische Galerie said, if it doesn't stand on a shelf, it's not library, it's going to be artist archives. So we automatically have, right from the beginning, we have crates, and some of them have not been opened since 75, I believe, which still keep so much information, art historical relevant information, I'd like to add, on artists who have lived and worked in Berlin. And of course, the main issues is, why are we so slow? Why are museums so slow? Time, space, and money. They do matter a lot because space is limited. You have to have storage space. You have to have proper storage space with the adequate climate conditions and everything. So that keeps many museums today from accepting estates, of course, because you need to keep them in a proper way. Time, of course. You need staff and time to get acquainted with the material you have added to the collection. And of course, to pay the staff, you need money. So I'd like to add, of course, that's one of the reasons why museums are so slow. They have to be slow because there's no other way. You need time to be very deliberate because you do not want to throw things away. Sometimes that's necessary too, I have to add, and you have to be very realistic with that. So, that's one very good example, I'd say, Fetus. That's an artist of the so-called life reform movement, which started in the late 19th century. And his work was considered very long to be kitsch, to be really hideous, to be not part of the art history. But the founders of Berlinische Galerie, they accepted the estate, they even bought it, they kept it. And today, we realize how important this movement was at that time. Being revolutionary, being anarchist, being a pre-hippie movement in the arts. So at that time, when they bought it for the collection, everybody was like, really? Do you want to accept that for a collection of a museum? You can't be serious. Same thing here, A completely different case, I have to add. One day, I received a phone call from a colleague in Munich, and he says, well, there's a lady in my office, and she has the estate of an artist called Benno Bernays, who died in the First World War. He was a pilot. He was with Paul Cassirer, at the time one of the most important gallerists in the German Empire, and his family kept the estate since 1916. It was hidden for 70 years. And of course, I was like, really? I couldn't believe what was happening. So that's another very good example. So many things have disappeared, and they need to be rediscovered. They need to be worked on, they need to be researched. So in this case, it's a completely different example. An artist who was forgotten for a very long time was rediscovered. So, another very interesting example, I told you that the founders were very much interested in artists who had been persecuted during the National Socialist dictatorship. And one good example is Eric Salomon. He was a son of a banker, brought up in a very grand bourgeois context. First he studied law, then he studied engineering, then he founded a taxi company. And by by putting a very smart text into the newspapers, advertising his taxi company, he was discovered by Ullstein, a publishing company, and he started a career as a photographer. He was killed in 1944 in Auschwitz, and most of his work was destroyed by the Nazis, but his son could escape, and he took some of these negatives and works with him to London. So again, a very good example of something where there's no doubt that a museum has to accept that kind of estate, which needs to be worked on and rediscovered. Another very good example, the Dadaist movement was recognized relatively late as a relevant artist movement. So the founders of Berlinische Galerie already, they bought the Raoul Hausmann and the Hanehoek archive, which was on the market at that time and very accessible. It was far away from the prices you can ask for today. And among the estates, of course, there's not only art, because usually we have been talking today about works of art. We accept documentary archives as well, like photographs, autographs, and everything you can find. And the book we have here, that's Hanehoek's address book, which is like a history book on 20th century art history. You can find almost everybody who was of relevance in the world of art during her time. So you have to be very flexible in a museum. You have to accept many, many different things to be able to judge what can be developed from that. Yeah, and I'd like to underline that museums do not only accept artists' archives or artists' estates. There are, of course, art dealers' estates, which are just equally important for provenance research and various other things. So one of the most prominent estates and we have is the Ferdinand Möller archive, a gallerist active from the 20s to the 40s. And today, of course, we accept as well curators' estates. The other day, I received a phone call from a journalist telling me that Christos Joachimides, who was one of the most important curators in Berlin in the 80s and 90s, he was about to leave his apartment, and his basement was full of files and crates with his archive, if we would like to have it. And of course, I said yes immediately, although we had to send our archivist into that basement with a mask and in a special suit because it was all rotten. But still, I think these extreme examples show you how broad the spectrum is for museums to work on. And I like to underline again that this can be the basis of a very visionary museum work, that you continue to work on the estates as a resource of your collection, and all the ideas you develop are based on the estates which were accepted by the museum. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, and now the second one. Yes, that's it. I think that one of the very important issues when discussing the question of museums is that heritage is not what we like now. It has a much broader and longer scope. Gerhard Marcks was born in Berlin, 1889. He died near Cologne, 1981. And in the early 1930s, he was seen as the next big thing in Germany. You see here, 1932, Castalia was presented with Alfred Flechtheim, and at that point, everybody thought, well, this is going to be the next important artist, sculptor from Germany. He was presented in this famous exhibition at MoMA, German art, as the youngest sculptor. And then in 1933, the National Socialists took over, and it was more or less the end of this idea of a career. 1945, he was seen then as the one German artist who had stayed in the country and who had not collaborated, so he became very famous for war memorials. The most important war memorials in Germany are made by him. He made a career as a sculptor in the 1950s, mostly, and then in the 1960s, he sees that his fame is waning. And he comes up with the idea of making a foundation. The main idea is, at the moment, they do not like my work. But what if somebody wants to discover it in 10, in 20, in 30 years? And therefore, he develops the idea of making a foundation, and he goes to German cities, like, you know, I have a foundation, would you want to have it? And Berlin didn't want to have it. He came from Berlin. Hamburg didn't want to have it. Cologne didn't want to have it. And the only ones who wanted to have it was Halle. But that was, at that time, East Germany. So it was unthinkable to bring, you know, 500 sculptures, 15,000 drawings into the GDR. So what then happened was that there was one museum in Germany that was had a very strong conservative approach, and it was not interested in what was happening in contemporary art, and that was the Kunsthalle in Bremen. The director there, around 1970, when asked, what do you like about contemporary art? He said, yes, I like contemporary art, like Max Beckmann. And together with Günter Busch, the director of the Kunsthalle, the idea emerged to make a Gerhard Marcks Foundation. The foundation is a very intriguing thing that then was established in 1969. It is the works of Gerhard Marcks, and we have in our papers, it says this museum is there to make the work of Gerhard Marcks accessible to everybody, and also to work on contemporary and modern sculpture. So we have a very broad scope. And the other thing, which is very funny, is that the second part of the contract is, and the state of Bremen pays for it. So it's a very, well, typically German situation where you have, on the one hand, the freedom of a foundation, and on the other hand, a state that does the funding. On the other hand, we have the estate of Gerhard Marcks, and we have a very strict line. There you have the estate, there you have the foundation, but we do cooperate very closely. A member of the estate is part of our board. And we, for example, try to place this artist proactively into artistry. He was forgotten for a long time, and what we are now have been doing over quite a period of time is trying to re-establish him. And that piece plays a big role because Gerhard Marcks was at the Bauhaus. And one of the most famous chapters of our museum history is when we were contributing with loans for a Bauhaus exhibition, and we got a call from the museum if we would please change our insurance numbers because they were too low for a Bauhaus. Because our policy had always been, if you want to have it, if you want to make a Bauhaus exhibition, take Gerhard Marcks. And this has been our policy over years. Then the second director of the Gerhard Marcks House, Jürgen Fitschen, decided that just Marcks as a collection is not enough. He wanted to have other. And that brings me to an interesting point when it is about museums and working with estates. With all the different estates we have in our museums, we have different working relationships. And when preparing it, I just asked my staff, and I mentioned all the estates, and I just looked at their faces, whether it's fun to work with or whether it's not fun to work with. And that's something I'd like to tell you also about. We have, for example, we hold 100 works of Waldemar Grzymek. Grzymek is a very important sculptor for the relationship between East and West. He was an East German sculptor working in West Berlin, and he was so he is very important for the exchange. And while we know very well what Gerhard Marcks and what the estate of Gerhard Marcks does, and we therefore also help when it comes to the market, and people ask us, is this real? We can tell them. In Grzymek's case, we have no clue what the estate is doing, which is very intriguing because this brings us to the situation that we can never, we are working on an inventory, we show the works, but we never have this kind of active, like, oh yes, this is a Grzymek. We will tell you about it. So it's a very passive situation that then turns up. Gerhard Schreiter. Typical German post-war sculptor. It's what we call half modernism. Yes, you have to. And the funny thing is, you do not find that in museums. But if you then would go in 20, 30, 40 years and want to know how were the late 1950s and 1960s, early 1960s, we come to the very strange situation that people then think, well, everything in Germany was Joseph Beuys already. Well, it was not. And therefore so we have in this case, we own the works, we have the rights on the estate, and this does enable us to finance projects. For example, we made of this absolutely unknown sculpture a complete catalogue raisonné. And the funny thing is what happens, every scholar working on sculpture after 1945 in Germany has to look in that catalogue raisonné because he finds a reference that's normally not there. And the thing is, of course, seeing these three, you may think, oh God, figurative sculpture, it all looks the same. So one of our main goals from a scholarly point of view and our instruments is to maintain a legacy in developing precise terminology, to make people see why these three sculptures are so different, what is typical of sculpture in the 1950s, 1960s, and why this is very definitely a Schreiter and not a Marcks. And I wanted to end with this. Our museum is a very small museum. We have 14 people staff, but 3 scholars working on figurative sculpture. So whenever somebody is doing something on figurative sculpture in Germany, he ends up with us. And what we do is whenever we are asked to write something, well, there will be at least one image of a Gerhard Marcks. So that is also a very important role. But what I wanted to show you here is Hanna Koszynski. It's a very intriguing thing. It was an estate that was held within the family, and the family has tried and tried to bring it into a museum over many years. I don't know how many museums were asked to take it. And nobody wanted to have it. And then they came to us, and we saw it, and we said, wow, here you're talking about a woman who made a sculpture in Paris in 1913, had it already cast there. That's very intriguing about the piece. And we then started doing a little research. We found out that she was even earlier in being famous than somebody like Willem Leenbroek. So we said, we want to have it. Great, this is an important piece. Nobody knows it, but bringing it in a museum is something. But the point is, that's the good piece. We took it all. Especially the right work is typical then for the early 1930s religious expressionism. And that is the question that we will be discussing later on of dead weight. We have a lot of Christian kind of works of a not very high aesthetic quality now in this bequest, and we love it. We learned to love it because having this stuff, my colleagues started working on it, and they found out that this is a very representative artist when it comes to the role of women artists in the 1920s being avant-garde-ish in Paris and absolutely not being allowed being avant-garde-ish in Germany. This is an intriguing point, and so we are kind of trying to position that artist. And I think the best thing that happened to us was that when our staff was asked to write an article on that piece in a catalogue for the Willem Leenbroek Museum, we wrote, well, you know, she was earlier than Willem Leenbroek, and the essay was refused, which I think shows that we do our work quite well, and the essay was published now anyhow. That were my remarks. Thank you. Shall we start by commenting on the things we heard from each other? That must be fun, I think.
Well, what was still lacking was the visionary aspect. So we were all talking about artists who are not alive anymore. But the reality is that, many artists approach museums today asking them if they would accept their estates. And I think that's going to be a very tricky question for the next, years, how to deal with these requests. And what we try to do is to give advice. Our policy has changed completely. We will not and we cannot accept full artists' estates. We accept them partly, if we accept them at all. So what we try to do is to give advice, what to do before an artist dies. We try to give advice to the heirs or to the artists themselves. And I think that's going to be the only solution for the future, because it's impossible for a museum to deal with all that material. So I think that would be an interesting question for the discussion now, the visionary part of it, because it's, I do hope that the evolution of the digitalization will help solving these problems, because I'm afraid to say, but I think we will not be able to keep everything.
No.
It's a little bit complicated. And probably I take the risk to be a little bit rude, but I think sometimes history has its reasons to forget things. And sometimes we should forget it, probably. I think there's a reason for it. And now it's very hard, and I love all the differences, and I think there's an awful lot going to the Volkskunst, and there's an awful lot who can go into local folklore, and this is all worth being kept and being thought about and be studied, but I don't think we are in the area of art there. And I must say, as a museum, I even wouldn't think about it to accept it. I don't even want to answer the letter, I think, but this is too much. I will be polite. That's one thing. Secondly, I think it's true there's a huge problem with storage and all these kind of things, which all the museums have. But this will also say something. If you see, for instance, I was not a long time ago with Blistijn from Beaubourg, and I forgot the number, but they have like 30,000 pieces in their cellars. And not stupid pieces. Huh? They have, I don't know, 60, 80 Pevsners who never see the light. They have Picassos who never see the light, and so on, and so on, and so on, and so on. So I think we really have to ask one day, what is the function of a museum? If it's just being a storage, then I say we should invite Colruyt or Diddle or whatever. They're much better in storaging and handling these kind of things than museums are. Museums are even not good in it. This is a second. Third thing which I think is very important, and I think this is a really very crucial issue, is what do we want to tell with art to the future? And I think there we have a responsibility to the society and whatever, that art is not only a raw, what Lawrence Wien said, a raw of beautiful colored objects, but art is about the meaning, it's about an attitude, it's about thing, and there we have to see very honestly, does this mean something today? Can we do this something? Is this gives this new insight in history, gives us new insight in art, gives whatever. And I think this is very important, and if you are too busy with all the crap around it, then you're sinking. You're losing the essence. And the last point I think is very important, but this is a more general point. I'm more and more convinced that a museum should not collect. And I tell you why, because collecting is in the ICOM rules, and I think we should take this away. I think we should leave it. And I tell you why, because first of all, art became so expensive and speculative that you can ask morally the question, can you buy art with public money? That's one thing, because it's speculation in 80%. This is one very important thing. Secondly, I think if you really work very hard with collection, if you see the history of collections of museums, then you see a certain period, there's an awful lot of interest in this, and then it disappears, and for 20, 30 years, nothing comes back from this period, and then you see another period coming back, and this you see this kind of movements. Why should you keep all these things if you're just interested during 10 years in the object you're busy with? So I'm really defending more and more. I don't know, I'm not right, I'm sure I'm not right, but more and more I'm defending, why shouldn't we find new relations with estates, with private collectors, whatever? If I need 20 Warhols, well, I'm going to make a deal with the good collectors and with the good, because I'm interested not in the object of value, I'm interested in the object of knowledge. And if I need 20 Judds, then I will call Flavens, I have a problem, and I have an idea, and whatever. And then you can find. And if it really makes sense, I'm sure you will arrive to it. And let them, for the rest of the market, do what they have to do. So bringing all these things together, running this kind of estate is complicated.
Yes, absolutely. In our case, the original idea of the museum was very clearly to enable an audience to get into the depth of an oeuvre. So that's one of the reasons why we have these large collections. And the funny thing is actually going through that collection with people and then asking them what they think is good works and what are the bad works. You'll get thousands of answers, which makes it so interesting to have it in such a breadth. Whereas if you'd ask me, I would say, well, that could be a work to be a session. No, the funny thing of this collection is that it is complete. I think that you made a very important point, and we are confronted with that very much. I showed you the Schreiter, and when we did our research on Gerhard Schreiter, we did a kind of a comparative analysis of the situation of sculpture in Germany at that point. And so we're talking about those sculptors who made, you know, the reliefs on the banks, and we're talking about post-war Germany, and we landed with about 4,000 sculptures. Just imagine if all these 4,000 estates should have to go into a museum. On the other hand, our discussion at that point was that we said, well, there is none in any museum. And the point will be, at one point, it will be all gone. So at least have one kind of the possibility to look into it. The other thing is what you were referring to is that people now come to us, you know, heirs of one of the 4,000, asking us whether we would be willing to take the estate, and the answer is very clearly no. But we do advise in how to document the complete thing, because I think that is the way the role of museums is starting to change, that we are the ones who know what is the information that has to be, you know, that will be relevant for further. And even if something is destroyed, has it been documented well?
Well, ownership, very big question.
Yes.
Who owns the estate? I mean, we have been confronted with many legal problems involved. I mean, I'm not talking about lawyers again today, but they can be very important and they must be consulted. But we're dealing with these issues all the time. So, I mean, restoration, legal questions, tax questions. I mean, all these questions cannot be solved by a museum. That's clear. We're not in charge. We can give advice regarding documentation, restoration, but for the rest, legal advice or tax advice should be sought after elsewhere. So, but still, I mean, in many cases, we are confronted with a desolate state of the estate, you know, where people do not even know what they have or what was made. So it's, and that would be too much to ask of a museum, which is basically an institution funded by state money, to cope with the problems created in the past. So the better the documentation is, the better the state of an estate is, the easier it is to make in a selection for a museum collection, or, well, to put some pieces on the market again, which in most cases does not exist anymore, which is another problem. You know, you couldn't even sell even if you wanted to do so. And I'm not talking about Rauschenberg.
I know. Well, in our case, we, for example, there are, one of the main problems is, I don't know the technical English term, would be something like a rest estate. You know, the things that were left after everything was sold. And that's the worst thing that can happen, that they then come to a museum and then are very disappointed that you do not want to have it. Well, of course you do not want to have it. So that is the, but let us discuss from all of you three the question, what you expect from an artist estate. In your case, is there any artist estate where you would say, well, yeah, I'll take it for my museum?
No, that's what I mean. I'm not interested in the object of value.
Yeah.
I will work together, and first of all, I have to be interested in the artist. That's one thing. Secondly, and this is much more important, I think, if you do something with the artist, it should mean something for the artist. If I make an exhibition, a Rauschenberg, for instance, who cares? Nothing will change, except if you have a very particular small thing, but this will not change the reality or the perception or whatever of Rauschenberg. I cannot bring anything to this artist. So if we work with an artist, the first thing we always ask, if you make an exhibition, what does this mean for the artist? Within our small scale, we are very conscious that we are small scale, that we can just play a role on that and that level, and that we can influence a little bit this and this and this, and we are not a Tate and we are not Bobour, but this you have to be very conscious, and if you cannot make this difference, then forget it.
Yeah. Okay. In your case?
Which is a pity, because an awful lot of artists that I would like to work with, that I can do, because I cannot make the difference. But for instance, we did recently, last year, 2 years ago, we did a fantastic show, which was much above our level. of all the date paintings of 1966 of Onkawara, because it made sense for him. And he really wanted to bring all these paintings together. And by a game of random, it came in our place, and I'm saying, yes, we do it, even if I cannot make the difference for Onkawara.
Okay. Well, I think collecting means curating a collection, and that implies selection. So automatically, it's impossible to accept all what's offered to you. So yeah, if we are approached, we encourage the artist or his heirs to select themselves, and we try to help them to analyze the situation. We try to tell them if it makes sense in the context of our collection, because nobody wants his estate to disappear in the depth of a museum storage. It's not about having a roof simply to house it. So the question is, will the institution be able actually to work with it? Are they really interested? Or is it just a matter of orphanage, you know, like accepting an abandoned child? So there has to be a very constructive strategy to work with a specific estate you are confronted with. And I think that's the solution. And I'm not going to stop to collect, by the way.
Yeah, but, yeah, it's a very delicate thing, collecting, because there is another element why I'm very doubting about collecting. And now I'm probably going a little bit too far, but if you see all the museum collections in Europe, you have to see why they are good collections. And it's nearly always the basis was a private collection. It's the private collector who made a good collection. Once it becomes an institutional collection, it becomes compromised.
You may react.
No, absolutely. If you see the Gulbenkian collection, if you see the Van Abbe Museum collection, once it becomes an institution, it becomes compromised. Yeah. Nearly always. And I see rarely good museum collections who are not built on a very important input from a private collection.
You don't agree, do you?
I disagree profoundly, of course. I mean, private collections are very subjective collections, and institutional approach is more distant, I'd say, and that's necessary. And well, the relevance of a private collection may be there, yes, of course. But where are the surprises in a private collection, please? I mean, I love to open crates which haven't been opened since '75. Of course. Because you never know what you might discover and which might be added to art history. Private collection, frankly, I'm not too much interested.
Well, the funny thing is, you may have seen that we have almost answered all the questions that were on there. I would like to open up the discussion with the audience. So if people have questions, yes, there are. So we ask for the people with the microphones.
Thank you. I'm Erica Klaus from Canada. I'm an art appraiser, and I have occasion to work with many artists who are nearing or over 65 years old. And they are really struggling with what to do with their bodies of work and with their archives. And I've discussed this with many curators at major institutions in the country, and one particular curator who deals with photography has told me that she receives a phone call from important Canadian photographers once a week to ask about disposing their collection. So I'm wondering, Mr. Köhler, you had some comments about that, and I'm just wondering if, from all of you, if you have thoughts on how to deal with this conundrum.
Well, I can answer, first of all, from our position, as we are confronted very often, as we are one of the few museums in Germany that still have a very strong kind of sympathy towards figurative sculpture. So any figurative sculptor in Germany knows us, they contact us, and our answer by now is see to it that you get a proper documentation of your work, and we will help you with it, and we'll put that documentation in our library. And the funny thing is that I'm working on such a proper documentation as a process for an estate, or mostly the old artist, is often a very good way of finding appraisal of what is happening in my work, what is valuable, and then you can always ask, then the next phase is the discussion, what are you going to do with it? And in some of these cases, works went to people who are very happy with it. They did not go into museums, but people are very happy with it, so that's okay.
Hi, my name is Alison Croft. I manage a recently established art foundation based in Beirut, Lebanon. And my question is for Joost. Why did you say a monograph is the death of an artist? Can you explain?
It's a little bit out of experience, I must say. But when we started the Hans Hartog Foundation, you know, in the south of France, every village has its own private foundation. You cannot name it, or every artist has his foundation. And if you go through it, then you don't see anybody there. It's for years the same work. They don't have the money to entertain the building, neither to change and to make it active. And it's absolutely, completely boring. That's one thing. There's a second thing, which is much more delicate if it's not a very well-known artist as we have here. And I give an example. In Belgium, there's a very good painter, I don't know name his name, a very good painter. And in the 80s, the government didn't find anything better than to create a beautiful house done by a good architect and to bring all his estate in this building. And I must say, in the beginning, in the first 2-3 years, there was quite a lot of people going. And everybody was applauding. Yeah, beautiful, fantastic, great, everything. The only problem is, because this is in the foundation, they cannot move anymore. They can move the works, but they cannot have any link anymore with the commercial market. And that means that all his best works, and this is 80%, are in the foundation. If you have 80% of your work in the foundation, that means you cannot create a market anymore. This market is not interested anymore. Nobody is interested anymore in him. And he's a great painter. He's the same level of Guston. And nobody will talk about it. So what I try to say, you have to be very careful that you enclose, that you imprison an artist. Instead of that, you have to give them this freedom. And if an artist like that, if from this artist where I'm talking about, if 60% would have been available with the because this is absolutely true, sometimes people were forgotten and were rediscovered and whatever. I mean, the rediscovery certainly now, he could have been a beautiful career. And he could be known internationally without any problem. It's a fantastic painter. But everything is in this.
Hi, I'm Amanda Rotterman from Withers Bergman in New York. My question is, do you see loan-to-gift acquisition models? Do you have a preference for maybe a short-term loan-to-gift or a long-term loan-to-gift? Thank you.
So we do it all the time, because as somebody said here, it's not only about artist estates, it's also estates by curators or estates by collectors. And what we try more and more to do is loan agreements, but with a maximum of 10 years. Like, for instance, we just took over a very important collection, a very, very important collection, very, very important collection, and we said 10 years, that's it. Well, because what we experienced also, we coming out of a museum of a private collection. And this was a collection linked to the 20s. It was a fantastic collection, very popular, whatever. And now the interest in this work is absolutely gone. And if you see now with the historical background, the quality of the collection was not so good.
Well, I prefer gifts to loans, even if they are on long term. We try to avoid having long-term loans, actually, unless it's really very, very high-scale work. But we're not the place for loans. If you're interested in being represented in a museum with your collection, I mean, you have to give it to the place. I mean, that's philanthropy, and that's why we usually reject these offers.
But this I don't agree, because the problem is that you put such a ballast on the future of this museum. You cut his complete freedom. That's what we got. We got a beautiful collection linked to the 20s and 30s, And now this collection is absolutely, completely uninteresting for all younger generations.
How can
but
you
we have
judge?
it.
How can you judge?
Yeah, I don't say it will come back, because you can judge it. So if you have 50 answers, and you know what the good answers are, and you have 2 bad ones, it's not so difficult to judge. We have to accept that there's something as knowledge about the work. We have the good names of this generation, but we have the bad work. And the thing is, you have to insure it, you have to work on it, you have to keep it, you have to acclimatize it, you have whatever. That I say, this work would much be better on the market than you make a small collector very happy with a beautiful painting, and at least we can work on the things that we have to work.
Okay. Well, you saw very clearly that there are very different positions on this field. Last question? No? Everybody wants to go for the drinks?
Yes.
So, thank you very much.
Thank you.